Hiya and welcome to my home office. I wanted to just do a little video today about how to read, how to understand hand-dyed yarn, because there are a lot of different types of hand-dyed yarns out there, and I've seen a few posts on social media groups recently with people finding that they're not getting the results that they're anticipating from the yarns that they're buying and things like that. So I wanted to show you what we can do. Okay, so as you can see, I've got quite a wide range of different yarns and things sat on my desk ready and waiting. So let me sit down and we'll go through these one at a time. So in the middle here, just as a starting point, we've got semi-solids. So usually as an indie dyer, we tend to go with calling things semi-solids rather than solids, because it's quite difficult to get a completely even colour throughout. But that's in some ways that's a good thing, because it means that you get quite a lot of depth. So there are very slightly different shades in there. So that shows when you work up that you'll get a sort of a depth to the colour as you're knitting. So these are notionally sort of a one colour yarn. You would buy it as for doing colour work or just for sort of a single colour item, but it should give you just a little bit more depth, just because there's a little bit of variation, just some depth to it as you work with it. So those are semi-solids. So the next one that I'm going to show you is the one that people seem to be struggling a lot with, which is space-dyed yarns. So space-dyed yarns, let me just stand the camera up, she says, and open this out. So this one is dyed by Dina's Home of Crafts, and if I open this out, you can see that it has sections of colour. So in this case, it has a section of a turquoisey, greeny colour and a section of a sort of a speckledy, sandy colour. So, and then sections of undyed white yarn. So when you're buying yarn, the first thing that I will say is do not be afraid to ask to open up the skein. Do not be afraid to say, can I see how that looks when it's opened out? Because it's very difficult to see when it's all skeined up exactly what the colour patches are going to be like. So I'm going to open out these two as well. So this one I've dyed. This was highly commended, which we dyed after I dyed after we'd done the Knitting and Crochet Awards last year. So you can see it's sort of mostly a sparkly grey, and then it's got a section of gold at one end. And this one, which is dyed by Wonderfully Woolly, is a rainbow skein. So it changes colour as it goes round. And if I turn it around, so it's space dyed in sections with the colours fading into one another. So when you're looking at a space dyed yarn, you need to look at what you're thinking of making with it, because the way that the yarn will work up will be different depending on whether you're knitting in the round, whether you're knitting in the flat, the size of needles that you're using, and all that sort of thing. So this one here, if I go back to the Dina's one, I've got some here that I'd started knitting up as a jumper for one of my kids. So this is knitted in the flat, and you can see that those greeny turquoise lines, the greeny turquoise sections, so this bit here, equates to approximately 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 stitches with a fade on either end. So if I knew that, for example, I would be knitting on 4mm needles, I would know that for that section there is, I guess, about 20 centimetres long, thereabouts, maybe 25. So I would be using approximately, I don't know, 1.5 centimetres of yarn, up to between 1.5 centimetres and 2 centimetres of yarn per stitch. It's easy to work out how long that is. If you're wanting to be very precise, you can literally cast on 10 stitches, see how far, knit a row, see how far that takes you, when basically pull it back out and measure the yarn and see how far that is. But the idea is that you'll be able to see that, for example, okay, that's going to give me a block of maybe 13 to 15 stitches, and a smaller block of the yellow, so maybe 8 stitches or so of the yellow. Sorry, I've got threads coming through, and longer of the white. So you know that it's going to be a predominantly white item, but that you're going to have stripes of the different colours coming through. If you were doing socks or sort of a short circumference item, then the blocking, the colour blocks would come out differently. So for a lot of space dyed yarns and things, you'll find that you've got sort of either 1/4 of the skein each colour or 1/3 of the skein each colour, and you'll end up with socks that are really quite blocky. So it'll look sort of like this all the way up, maybe with the sections moving slightly to one side each time. And not everybody likes that effect. So if you don't want blocky socks, you're better going for a different type of hand-dyed yarn, maybe one that hasn't been space dyed, or one that has been designed space dyed but on a much longer skein, so that you get long enough colour repeats that you can get a whole round of your sock in a single colour. So a lot of these are marketed as self-striping yarns. Those will have been either space dyed like these ones have, or they will have been sort of knitted up by machine into what we call a sock blank, and then dyed in sections, so that you have that colour change going through it at the right pace. But again, if you were then to use a sock blank yarn to make a jumper or to knit something in the flat rather than in the round, you would not get that same pattern going up. You wouldn't get, it wouldn't appear self-striping if you worked it up in a different way. So if we look at this one, the highly commended, you can see that it would be mostly a grey colour, but then you would get, because this is a 4-ply, it's about, if you were using 2.5mm to 3mm needles, you're getting about 1 centimetre to a stitch. So this is, I'd go with about 30 centimetres long. 30 stitches of gold to about 90 stitches of the grey if you were doing a sock. So you would have sort of half, on a standard 60 stitch cast on, you'd have about half a row of gold followed by a row and a half of silver. But the likelihood would be that this would move very slightly each time. So if I bring you back over to this one, you can see the way the pooling's working on this one. So it would move a little bit each time. So it wouldn't always start in the same place. It would sort of maybe move along sideways. And if we go to this one, the rainbow one, you can see that each section is maybe 15 centimetres, 20 centimetres thereabouts. So you get 15 to 20 stitches of each colour before it changes and works its way round. So depending on what garment you were doing, if it was a sock, then based on the length of skein, you'd probably get just over 2 rows out of the whole thing. So a row would take you from about here through this colour change up to about here, and then the next row you'd be working your way back round to here. So you'd have sort of continuous rainbows working round your sock, but it would mean that you had those 2 colours next to each other on alternating rows, for example. So it would be sort of goldy colour followed by bluey colour followed by goldy colour again, bluey colour, and it wouldn't be exact, so it would cycle round, but you'd get sort of, there would be not quite so much pooling, I suppose, with the way that this one has been dyed, but there would definitely be a pattern to how the colours were working up. So that's space dyed, and that's the sort of patterning and pooling that you can expect with space dyed yarns. So a lot of people, as I said earlier, I've been reading posts on various forums recently. I'm just moving those out of the way, about people who've been put off because they haven't been able to see how their yarns would work up, and so they haven't ended up with the result that they'd wanted at the end. So there are other options. So these ones here are all dyed by Verity of Truly Hooked. No particular reason, just apart from that these are what I had to hand, because obviously I'm at home, not in the shop, and I wanted to show you what speckles are like. So these yarns have been not completely space dyed. They've been, let me open them out so you can see the effects. I'll open a few of them. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. So you can see that there are some bits which are grey and some bits which have been left undyed. But if I open it out a bit more, it is not as, I guess it's not as pronounced as to which bit's which. With the space dyed yarns, there's a very definite cut-off point. But I don't know if you can see here, this is slightly paler on this side, but if I turn it round, it's actually, through other parts of the skein, it's actually still the same grey. It's just that it's lighter on one bit. So again, up this side, you can see that it's been left slightly lighter at one point, but has been left darker going through. So it's not going to be as pronounced. And the way that Verity's used her speckles, so you can see that it's got lots of different flashes of colour working through it, down here as well. And that means that as you work it up, it's going to look a lot more random. It's not going to look like you have segmented blocks of grey and of white. It's going to look like it's mostly grey but with paler paler bits fleckled through it, and with all these different little bits of colour. And if you look at how long this bit of colour is, so that is the purple bit in the middle is less than a centimetre, with a pink bit either side stretching to, I guess, about a centimetre either side. So you've got at most 3 stitches of that pink, and it will just be a little pop of colour, just be a little fleck in the middle of your knitting, which means that it breaks it up and you don't get the same pooling that you get in the space dyed yarns. And similarly with this one, so this one is much more speckled than the previous one. So if I show you here, it really is tiny little speckles of colour going through it. So it really does just break up any pooling that might have occurred. So again, this one, there are paler sections, but the pale bit sort of moves slightly, so you're not going to get the same level of pooling. There might still be a little bit, but it's not going to be as distinct. And having the speckles in there, it just breaks it up and means that it's not going to be as noticeable. So speckles are a great way to mitigate some of the pooling that can happen. But there is another type of hand-dyed yarn, which I will show you now once I've moved these to one side. And these create this sort of effect. So I don't know if you can see, so this is a double knit sweater that I'm working on at the moment. The yarn was dyed by Rachel of Cap and Sparrow, and it's a double knit yarn. And the way that it's been dyed, so I have one here that I haven't wound up into a ball yet, but you can see that although it's almost like it's a semi-solid, I suppose, you can see that it's got dark bits and light bits, and colour variations going through it, but it's more than just being a semi-solid. I call these yarns marbled because they remind me very much of doing marbled pictures when I was a child. Where you dripper the oils onto the top of some water, and you lay the paper down on top, and you end up with this wonderful mix of all the colours, and there's no pattern to it, they just meld. So that's what I call these yarns, is marbled yarns. And you end up with this effect where there isn't pooling. It is variegated, you get all the different colours in there, but you don't get the pooling, and it's a more even texture. It doesn't draw your eyes to any particular bit, you just get an overall feel for it. And the queen of doing this is Desiree of Abercairn, who just dyes the most amazing yarns. If I show you this one, this is Deep Sky, and as you can see, it's got so many different colours in there. It's got blues, browns, pinks, purples, sort of hints of tealy greens, all sorts in there. But the way that it works up is like this. So you don't get lots of pooling of different colours. You just get all the different colours in there. And so she dyes it in all sorts of different colourways. And this is a cardigan design that I'm working on. By contrast, she dyed this one in a space dyed fashion, and so I ended up with colour pooling in this one. So this is a space dyed section, so you can see that she's had a pale green section and a lilac-y section and a sort of a tealy section as well. So it's just, you end up with this sort of pooling, which, as you can see, is completely different to the sort of the marbled effect. I quite like this in this bit, but you do end up with this sort of marbled effect on the other sections. So if you're wanting to have the variation of colour in your work, but you don't like this pooling, then the best option the best thing that you can do is to look for a yarn that is pooled rather that is marbled rather than space dyed. Now, it can be quite difficult to tell, because if I bring this rainbow one back, if the dyer had needed to reskein this, so wind it again, maybe it had got tangled or what, they just couldn't get it looking neat and they needed to wind it again, it would have been it would have looked maybe closer to the marbled than it obviously does here. But the way to do that, again, if you ask if you can open the skein out, or if you're buying online, ask them how long the individual colour sections are. If it's you can probably also tell on the picture. So this one, you can see that the individual colour sections are not very big. So it's changing colour there and it's changing colour here. So you can see that on that one strand that it changes colour as it goes. Whereas these, even if it was wound up again in a different, you would still be able to see that that red section, for example, would stretch quite a long way. And as I say, don't ever be afraid to ask. All hand dyers want is for you to enjoy using their yarn. They put so many hours of love and attention into every single skein they dye. They would hate it if you weren't happy with the effect that you got when you actually worked with it. So don't be afraid to ask how long the colour repeats are, whether it has been space dyed, just don't be afraid. Try out, measure how long your stitches are on particular needles or hooks, because it doesn't matter whether it's knitting or crochet. Just work out how long you're using for each stitch, and then you'll know for how many stitches you're likely to get for each section. So for this marbled one, it really is so few stitches. There's 5 there, and that's probably the most I'd ever get of the same colour. Whereas this one over here, what was it? We said something like 13. So you can work, and my experience is that pooling tends to be worse in crochet as well, because the stitches tend to be bigger. So try and look at how big your stitches are and equate that to how long each section is going to look in your work. And again, if you're making something with a small circumference, then it's going to work up differently. So think twice about using a space dyed yarn for the body of a garment as well as the sleeves, because you will get a very different block when it comes to doing it on a small circumference. So this pattern that I've got here on the main body of my cardigan will look very different when I do it on the sleeves. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's what you want and you're happy to have that variation. But if you're not keen on the pooling, or you want the pooling to at least look uniform throughout, then you can't use a space dyed yarn on the body of a garment as well as on the sleeves, because the pooling will change. It might also change very slightly between skeins as well. So depending on precisely where in the round you start. So if one skein, because usually skeins are dyed next to each other. So if I lie a couple of them out, just as an example. So say that I dyed these two next to each other. I know they're different colours, just bear with me. When I'm laying them out, I might not necessarily pay attention to the fact that the tie that goes with the start of one skein might be, it's here on this one. So that's the tie that is the start of the yarn on this one. But the tie that's the start of the yarn on this one is down here. And that's going to make a difference. So if all of your orange is up here, and then your red, and then your pink, and then your purple, and that sort of thing, where you start one yarn on your project, you might start with a greeny colour, and when you get round to it, you might need to try and colour match where you've got to on the next skein. So you might need to try and wind a bit off and start closer to where you think you are on the way round that set of colours, just to try and match where the pooling is, or where the stripes are going, that sort of thing. The alternative, basically what will happen is that even if you are very careful, it will change slightly. So you might find that you'll skip. You see where I've got sort of relatively even bits of teal, you might suddenly find you've got an extra row of teal, and then a gap without any, just as it gets itself sorted. Or it might change its pattern entirely, just depending on precisely where you are around your garment at the time. So it's just things to bear in mind when looking at how your yarn will affect the overall look of your garment. But yeah, if you're not a fan of pooling, then I would suggest looking for yarns that have a shorter colour length, so only a few stitches of a colour at a time, or ones that are intentionally sort of marbled like this, or like this one, ones that intentionally only have very short colour repeats, or potentially go for semi-solids, or for ones with lots of speckles in them, because again it'll hide a lot of those pools, and just mean that it's a little bit more even all the way over. On the other hand, if you quite like that, which I do, I think that's quite fun, then have lots of fun with your space dyed yarns. But just do remember that the pooling will change depending on whether you're working in the flat, whether you're working in the round, and the width or circumference of what you're working on. So I hope that's helped, and that hopefully you will have a better idea as to how to look at a hand-dyed yarn, and what sort of effect it might have at the end of your project. So good luck, happy crafting. Bye for now.